we are Christians and we're also Africans. Therefore, for Christianity to make sense to us, it must maintain biblical properties, it must be relevant, it must be authentically biblical, but it must be relevant to the African Christian context and situation. Therefore, we must, as African theologians, we must be able to tackle the subject matter of African Christian theology. Just as I have underscored that African Christian theology scratches where it itches. Where it aches, it scratches. Number two, it addresses African questions that the Western theology promulgated, documented, defined, and defended by people like Millard J. Erickson, J.I. Parker. It cannot address our issues. Issues of female genital mutilation, issues of African initiations, issues of a woman marrying a woman in an African culture. It does not necessarily mean lesbianism, because they marry for other cultural issues in a different context. Therefore, we need African Christian theology. It is the reflections of African Christians, according to Mbiti. And we discussed that it is the theology that happens in south of Sahara. We have excluded the Egyptian Coptic churches and the Ethiopian Orthodox churches. They are not part of our study in African Christian theology. And we have defined. We have also looked at critical terms of African Christian theology. We have looked at terms like inculturation, where Christianity enters a particular culture. We have looked at intraculturation, where Christianity impacts the culture and the culture impacts Christianity. We have looked at acculturation, where a person goes back and learns his distinct culture. We have also looked at a term. The term is indigenization. That is making Christianity be relevant to the indigenous culture that is prevalent in that particular context. It's called indigenization, but it is more rigid. It's just like Africanization, making Christianity African, have a black lens, make Christianity become more African. It's called Africanization. But I want to warn you, there is another term that is called syncretism. Syncretism is a critical mixture of Christianity and whatever culture, until what comes out of it is not that culture, neither is it Christian. It's called syncretism. There is what we call incarnation. That is taken from the context of Jesus. But Christianity, when it comes, it incarnates, it takes the thought forms. It takes the expression, the idiomatic expression of the particular people. We also discussed the sources of African Christian theology. The Bible, of course, is the indispensable source, according to Luke. And I concur with him that the Bible is authoritative. And it is the basis of African Christian theology. We have African traditional religion is a source of our theology. In fact, Mbiti calls it that African traditional religion was preparatio evangelii. The Latin word for African culture was preparing it. It was preparing us to receive the gospel. Some people call it prevenient grace. People is a concept of systematic theology, where God prepared people to receive the gospel. It's called prevenient grace. But I like to proceed proceed and say that in African Christian theology, we have other sources that include our culture, the preachings of the Africans, like Vitabu is one of the apps that you open. It talks about our culture. I have my sermons in Vitabu. It is a source of theology. Our sermons, our songs. Yes, oh, did you wish? It is a Pokot song. Of course, I come from the diocese of Kapenguria, so it's not bad for me to sing from that particular culture. But it is very rich in theology, and it is a source of theology. Songs, poems, all these are sources of African Christian theology. The second place we went and looked at the different trends of African Christian theology. Number one, we looked at the cultural theology. This is where Christianity was made relevant in the African context and situation, using African using African mediums of expression, African idioms. You are supposed to, the Bible is always immutable. Culture is mutable. You make the unchangeable word fit the changeable context of the African situation and context. And that's why the term that I forgot to mention because of now is contextualization. Contextualization is more dynamic than indigenization and Africanization. They are more static. But contextualization, with the passage of time and situation, indigenization makes Christianity to be relevant with the changing context and situation. It's more dynamic, it's not rigid. The second trend is not only the cultural theology or inculturation. The second trend is called the black theology, the South African black theology. I want to tell you that its origin and inspiration is at the onset the Latin liberation theology. That was concerned with the poor. But back at home, back closer home, it is the North American black theology. That was motivated by people like James Coney. And it's based on black power, but it is more secular. The South African black theology was motivated by black consciousness, by Steve Biko. Steve Biko was a leader. You remember Basil Moore started the South African University Student Organization. But it was not radical, it was mild. So Biko started South African Student Organization, SASU. And SASU was more radical on black consciousness. And it is the soul of South African black theology. It is not secular. It gives room for reconciliation. And there are two very critical documents in South African black theology. One, there is a document that is called the Kairos document. The other one, the Road to Damascus document. These are very critical documents as you look at South African black theology. Some of the leading theologians you will discover there is Alan Busak. There is Desmond Tutu. He is the doyen or the father of liberation theology. They championed against oppression. And when you're oppressing, you're walking on the road towards Damascus. But when you side with the people who are oppressed, you make an about turn and you fight against the oppression. And even Somebody said that if his Bible was supporting apartheid, he could have thrown it. And he read the Bible and he discovered that the Bible is a very liberative document. There is a question that Desmond Tutu asks. Liberation theology and cultural theology. Are they soulmates or strange bedfellows? The truth of the matter is that the two are not strange bedfellows. I believe that they are soulmates, and the two should complement, not compete with one another. Number three, it took time to look at African women theology. And we looked at African women theology, and we said that African women theology, they do not want to be associated with the term feminist theology. Why? Because number one, they believe that feminist theology only concentrates on, it's a middle class upper thing. It sees the man as the enemy. But African liberation, African women theology do not see men as the problem. Because both men and women are equally oppressed by an oppressive system. They are equally oppressed. They don't see them as the... And they say that feminist theology does not deal with the race issues. It deals with only women issues. Does not deal with issues of race and class. So it's a wrong theology. The doyen of African women theology is Mercy Amba Obioyi. And she battles with many issues. And you will discover that there are many statements by Africans. I'm going just to look at it in a few minutes. There are many statements by church fathers that were very oppressive on women. And women did not have a position in the church. The leadership was taken by men. And you will discover that the majority of church members are women. And you'll find some of the proverbs are very, very terrible. Anything bad was attributed to who? In fact, in particular culture, like when somebody says your mother, it's very bad. So there are proverbs in the African culture, even I can't mention it in that community, how they say it's very bad. There are some proverbs that are very, very oppressive proverbs used against women. But we'll remember that they are very balanced, the African women theologians. They are very balanced in the sense that they are also liberating proverbs. The mother is looked as the mother of all generation, is the nourisher, is the homemaker. There are some liberating aspects, but there are also some liberative aspects. We look at patriarchy. What is patriarchy? Domination of men over women. And sometimes women are caricatured as sexual objects and workers and slaves. That is what African women theology came to fight against. So that we can look at women not only in terms of being exploited because of their sexual orientation, but we can look at women as co-workers. And you remember there is the circle of concerned African women theologians that sought to nurture theology and to make the voice of women heard, because theology was a cave for men theologians only. They sought to bring the voice of the women and temper the theological discourse that was going around. I want to say that the sources of African women theology, number one is the Bible. Number two is the African culture. Number three, African women experiences. Their experiences are very critical. What they go through in FGM, what they go through in marriage, what they go through in issues and situations of life, what they go through. It's very, 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 very rich in our theology. And I want to say some of the interpretations that they have. Number one is a revisionist interpretation of the Bible. They interpreted the Bible, but from a revisionist point of view. That is one set of theology. They emphasize biblical texts that stresses the roles and the contribution of women. Biblical texts that emphasizes, like the story of Mary and Martha. So they wanted to revise the interpretation. The traditional interpretation was who was doing good. Was it Martha or Mary? Amen. The traditional interpretation. You remember the story of Martha and Mary. Jesus had gone to visit them. What was Martha doing? Cooking. What was Mary doing?
Listening to Christ.
Listening. So traditionally, who do you think was doing the right thing? Martha. Because she was there cooking. But in the revisionist interpretation, we interpret the text differently. And we see that the hero of this story is not Martha, it's Mary. Because Mary sat down with male disciples and was listening to teaching, to Jesus teaching. That's what the ladies are doing here. Like Doreen and my sister-in-law there. They are listening to the teaching of the Lord like fellow men. And what did Jesus say? Who has done the better thing? Mary. She has sat down and listened. So Jesus did not endorse this caricature that a woman should only be in the kitchen cooking. But a woman can sit and listen. That is what we call the revisionist interpretation. And I challenge you that apply revisionist interpretation as you do your theologizing. Number two, there is reconstruction or deconstruction. This is a very radical way of interpreting. Like you remember in Genesis 21. No, Genesis 22. Abraham goes and sacrifices the son by the name of Isaac. And they say the Bible is, this deconstruction is not closer to the evangelical or the biblical interpretation. They seek to reconstruct biblical stories and find the male bias as people have written the scriptures according to their understanding. They said Isaac is spared. But you remember the story of Jephthah. Jephthah said that God, whatever comes first, I will sacrifice. And the daughter comes first. And according to this interpretation, in the writers of the Bible, because they are so male biased, the daughter is not spared, she's sacrificed. But according to my understanding, it's a biased way of looking. I critique. Why? Because when you look at the story of Jephthah, Jephthah tells the lady to mourn her virginity. According to me, there was no human sacrifice, as I interpret the scripture. Why? Because the woman was not allowed to get married and she lived dedicated to God. That was like a death sentence in a society where women were supposed to bear children. So this is a very radical way of reconstructing. But it has very little respect for scripture, because scripture is God-breathed. And it is authoritative. And it is God's word. It's not man's word, it is God's word. Number three, we have symbolic interpretation. It develops significant and positive female figures in the Bible, like Eve, the mother of all humanity. The last way of interpreting is a liberationist interpretation. It is to draw attention to women who are used to liberate, like Deborah, Judith. You remember the story of Judith who went to the commander-in-chief and cut his head, and took it in a basket. And God used Judith to bring victory. So there are women who are heroes. It's a liberative interpretation. And I want to say, as you look at scriptures, they are liberating and oppressive texts according to these feminist or women theologians. Genesis chapter 2 is considered oppressive. Do you know why? They look at it, those deconstructions, they look at it and discover that it's very oppressive. Woman was made second from the rib of the man. They look at it as very oppressive. And when you look at the story, the woman is caricatured as secondary. But they look at Genesis 1 as liberative. Why? Because it says God created him, male and female. He created them in his own image. When you look at Judges, how women are caricatured, it's very oppressive. And also 2 Samuel 13 and 1 Corinthians 14, where I do not permit a woman to speak. 2 Timothy chapter 2 is considered as very, very oppressive. It says, I permit a woman not to speak. Let her learn in submission and silence. For it was not a man who was deceived, but it was a woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Therefore, a woman will be saved through childbearing if she continues with holiness, sobriety, and propriety. They believe that that text is non-liberatory. It is a very oppressive text. So they look at the scriptures. Some of the texts are oppressive, non-liberating texts. But there are also texts that are considered as liberating. Genesis chapter 1, Judges chapter 4 and 5. You remember the story of Deborah. It's very liberating. 2 Kings 22, women have been used. Songs of Songs, very liberative. And the Gospels are very liberative. And Romans chapter 16, you remember the story of Priscilla and Aquila. In fact, Priscilla is the star, Aquila is just there. And you will discover that she's called an apostle. It's very liberative for women theologians. And you look at 1 Corinthians 11, where it says a woman covers her head while praying and prophesying. And when you look at Jesus and Paul's view of women, it's very liberating. Because you'll find, just as I told you, Jesus allowed Mary to sit with the disciples. So his disciples allowed Mary to sit with the disciples. You will discover that as you look at Luke, though the original 12 because of the Jewish culture, but the 72 there could be women. In fact, some people say on the road to Emmaus, you remember the road to Emmaus, Cleophas, and they are named disciples. Their named disciple might have been a woman. So you'll find that they are very, very, very liberating texts. And oppressive texts are not necessarily oppressive, but they have been used by men to oppress women. That's why they are called oppressive texts. Now, let me, in a nutshell, let me also take time to look at some of the African theologians. There is a theologian called Bolaju Idowu. Bolaju Idowu, he was Nigerian, and he believed in what we call radical indigenization. According to Bolaju, the Africans are very comfortable going to the witch doctor and the pastor. Why? Because the Christianity that was brought from the West did not speak to his past. Since he did not speak to his past, he is very comfortable. He can go to a witch doctor, and you'll find that the African culture and Christianity are sometimes intermingled and critical. Because he needs Christianity and he needs something that addresses his past. and his ancestors. That's why Africans have two ideas of God. And he says that the church should stop speaking in a strange language, but it should speak in a language that addresses the African context. That's why there is need for radical indigenization based on the traditional concept of God, and you put it with a modern understanding. Number two, there is a theologian by the name of Kwesi Dixon. This one is Ghanaian. Kwesi Dixon. And according to him, the Bible and the culture should be our source of theology. But we have a problem between the formal and the informal theology. They don't match. Formal theology is the one ambayo mnafanya college. Informal theology is the one that is done by the practitioners of Christianity today. There is a mismatch. That's why we need to bring the two together. Sometimes what you preach might be different from the theology that we teach in systematic theology. True or false? Because the practical theology we need to match. And according to him, how do we match? What can we relate both the formal and the informal? Is to present Christ as our ancestor. The third theologian that I want to examine in short is Charles Nyamiti. He's a priest from Tanzania. He's a heavy Thomist, or Thomas Aquinas theology is very critical. According to him, the main sources of African Christian theology is the Bible, church tradition, church history. Those are the main sources. And he believed in three approaches to theology. One, dialogical. That is when you do dialogue, you draw parallels between the Christianity and the African culture. You do parallel, you do a dialogue between the two. Number two, you don't only do dialogue, you do what is called apologetical. Apologetics is the defense of the Christian approaches, of the Christian faith. It's called apologetics. When you are doing apologetics, number one, you expose the deficiency of our culture. You say, yes, our culture is good, but it is deficient. Number two, you show how the gospel fulfills our culture. And lastly, his approach is one, dialogical. Number two, apologetical. Number three, pedagogical. Pedagogical is a teaching methodology. And he argues that schoolmasters that lead people to Christ, we must have a philosophical approach that leads us to Christ. But we must begin with the concepts of God, concepts of humanity and death, and African and suffering. So there is dialogical, apologetical, and pedagogical. And he is known, Charles Nyamiti is known for presenting Christ as the ancestor. And he had a lot of theology about Africa. The other one is John Waligo. He's also a Catholic theologian. For him, there is a need for both inculturation and liberation. We need to do both for our theology to be relevant in the African context. So when you're doing inculturation, according to Waligo, number one, there is an existence of an African language. There is an African language that is supposed to be a vehicle of theology. Number two, there is an African culture. When you are doing a theology, the African language is critical. Number two, the African culture. Number 2, the African culture. Number 3, the laity should be involved in theology. It's not an enterprise of the theological college. Local leaders should be involved and local experts. The 5th one that I'm going to look at is Mercy Amba Oduyoye. Mercy Amba Oduyoye. We had talked about, he was a Ghanaian, but Mercy Amba was married in Nigeria. She had problems in the African culture and also in the culture of the church. You remember some of the church fathers used very derogatory terms to define women. Origen said that God does not stoop low to look at women. That is Origen, a respected church father. But sometimes what we call androcentrism and misogynism affects us. We look and despise women. John Chrysostom said, inside a woman is full of faith, but outside maybe there is no faith. Cyril of Alexandria said female sex is slow in comprehension. Is that true? That women do not understand things very fast. But I mark your papers. Sometimes men get distinctions. Sometimes you may be surprised. Ladies have gotten distinction. Since I have marked, over 10 ladies have gotten distinction in theology. That means it is not true to say that women are slow in comprehension. Sometimes they think faster than us. Tertullian said that woman is the devil's gateway. Yani mwanamke ni njia ya shetani. Is that true? Yes. For those who are weak in faith. You know, sometimes you are tempted by what you desire and crave. Gregory the Great says, woman stands for weakness. And Thomas Aquinas, says that a woman is a misquoted male. So he's a male, but he's wired differently. So how have women been caricatured wrongly? They have been abused in church, raped in vestries. And the language that has been used against women is very bad, especially in advertising. How are ladies promoted? Look at TikTok. Do you see what ladies do? They only show particular parts of their bodies in TikTok. That's how women have been misrepresented. Number 2, in folk tales, stories. Who is normally the villain? Who caused death? It's the woman. Proverbs. There are proverbs that discuss women badly. There is a subword proverb that says, there is a subword saying, one man told me, that maneno ya mama sikilia kwa kisogod wetu. But unaisikilia tu kwa kisogo. I'm afraid. Unaisikia, but unaisikilia kwa kisogo. There is a language that disempowers women. So women, according to Mercy Amba Oduyoye, women should not have the monopoly of being servants. Even men can become servants. And there is a way, and we talked about cycle of African women. There is the last one that I'm going to look at is Jean-Marc Ella. He's an African, he's a Catholic priest from Cameroon. And he emphasizes inculturation, liberation, and authenticity. He says the major challenge of African theology is to reject colonial structures. We reject colonial structures that are even in church. To reject the Western symbols in African culture. Should African Christian theology be done by expatriates? And according to him, he looks at the evil. You remember I was in Nairobi for meeting, a very big meeting for bishops and senior clergy. And I asked the question, there are three kinds of evil. One, there is what we call personal evil. Personal evil ni dhambi ya kutenda, wizi, usharati, ulevi, it's called personal evil. Second kind of evil is called institutional evil or structural evil. It's evil that is committed within the structure. Lastly, there is cosmological evil. People, demons, all the spirit is cosmological evil. So sometimes we emphasize one form of evil at the expense of the others. Let's deal with all the other evil. Just as you know, African Christian theology has, as we have studied, as dialogues with Latin American theology, with the black theology of the West, with the Asian theology. There is a lot of dialogue. And we look at God, how God is presented in the African culture, the systematic presentation of theology in the African culture. How is God presented? There is very rich language of God in the African doctrine of God. There is African divine names and attributes. And I want to say God is presented richly in the African culture. There is rich symbolism of how God is presented. You remember there is a lady by the name of Afia Gyan, an African. He describes God in rich African language. And there is God as the source of all things. God is presented as the source of all things. There is the fatherhood and motherhood of God in the African culture. God is presented both as the father and the mother. And it's very rich symbolism. And it makes us to question this exclusively masculine presentation of God. And I want to say that as God is presented in feminine and masculine terms and characteristics, it is all above the belt. Now, when we look at Jesus, you remember we discussed Jesus. And I took you to my paper, Christ, the supra ancestor. And I said some people see Christ in the African culture as a visitor, as the big brother, as the chief, as the ancestor. I thought was the ideal presentation of African Christology. The ideal presentation of African Christology. Now, when we look at the doctrine of Trinity, is it presented in African culture? Trinity, is Trinity there? I must say that Trinity cannot be found in general revelation, but there are adumbrations. There are adumbrations, there are hints in African culture. In Bukusu culture, God is described as three. Wele Kahaba, Wele Mohobe, Wele Muambu. So it borders on polytheism, but it can be a good introductory. The family is also an analogy of Trinity that we can find in African culture. Why the father, the mother, and the children. And even the living, the unborn, and the dead. That can be found as perfect analogies of Trinity in the African culture. So, some of the Muzamaki, I told you, Christ the war poet, Christ the prophet, those are some of the African theologies. So, I want to say as I conclude, that this is one of the units that is very critical. It's critical if you have to make sense. If you must make sense. If you must make sense in the church as a minister, you must understand African Christian theology. You must understand the Bible and the African culture. Whatever you theologize must be biblically authentical and African relevant. I challenge you to be African theologians. Do not only regurgitate the teaching of the West as you go out and you cram what Millard J. Erickson said, or J.I. Parker, or for that matter, Henry Clarison TSM, or all these other theologians, Wayne Grudem. Be a theologian who is critical and make your theology be relevant to the African context and situation. Therefore, as you go out, take in your hands philosophy. Take in your hands Old Testament and New Testament survey. Take in your hands African Christian theology. Take in your hands theology of development. Later, I'm going to add some few more things. Take in your hands African Anglican theologians. Take in your hands church planting, Anglican ecclesiology. And I pray that if you utilize this knowledge, you will become a better theologian and a relevant church pastor. Utilize this knowledge. It has been great teaching this class, the graduating class of 2022. It has been great interacting with you, debating, discussing, disagreeing, and agreeing. And all of it was done in the name of study. I pray that even as you do the exams, and even after the exams, remember that you are called to serve, you are called to be an African theologian, you are called to be an Anglican church minister. Go and serve to the glory and honor of God's name and for the betterment of humanity. In the name of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.